At exactly 3:17 a.m., I woke up to the kind of chaos that feels more like a fever dream than reality. Blaring alarms, screeching tires, and a strobing blast of red and blue lights dancing across my bedroom ceiling like some twisted disco of doom. My first thought wasn't coherent. It was instinct, pure animal-level fear gripping my chest as I stumbled toward the window, hands shaking, still tangled in sleep. And what I saw outside, it didn't make sense. Not at first. A convoy of unmarked SUVs lined the curb, tactical agents spilling into the street like ink across paper, moving with that hyper-controlled urgency you only ever see in war zones or action movies. Voices crackled through radios. Commands were barked in sharp staccato. The night had become electric, raw with purpose. But none of that explained the sickening emptiness, sitting like a punch in my gut when I looked down my driveway and saw nothing. The Jeep was gone. There are moments that tear open a loop in your mind, a question so loud, so all-consuming, that your body goes into full autopilot just trying to chase an answer. Mine was simple. Where the hell is my Jeep? It wasn't just any vehicle. It was the one I'd been specifically instructed, ordered, to keep parked there by the local law enforcement task force. A blacked-out, reinforced military-grade Jeep with high-end surveillance gear hidden in its bones, made to blend in and simultaneously intimidate. It was a node, a fixed surveillance point in an ongoing sting operation that had been tracking a drug ring crawling into the otherwise bland, meticulously trimmed veins of Willow Creek estates. And now it was just gone. In its place, a single bright orange parking cone, a passive-aggressive slap in the face. Stuck to it was a note, written in thick black marker on a neon sticky square. Code violation. HOA confiscated. Just that. No contact number. No explanation. Just those 3 words that may as well have been written in gasoline and set on fire. I stood there for a full minute, half-dressed, mind spiraling between horror and disbelief. Then it hit me, the terrifying weight of what that little sticky note really meant. The Homeowners Association had just stolen a federal surveillance vehicle. And not just stolen it, cut through its security lock like it was a bag of garden mulch, then dragged it off to God knows where, likely by some shady tow service that didn't ask questions as long as they got paid in cash. It was absurd. Comical, even, except that now I was the one standing in front of an active federal sting operation with absolutely no idea how to explain this mess. Let me backtrack for a second. Just a few months earlier, I'd moved into Willow Creek with a heart heavy from too many airports, too many deployments, and not enough quiet. After years serving overseas and a series of increasingly sterile apartment buildings in increasingly forgettable cities, I wanted something permanent, something rooted. I wanted peace, a backyard for my dog, a garage big enough to fix old motorcycles, a community that felt, well, human. For a little while, I thought I'd found it. The first weeks were idyllic. Neighbors waved. Kids played soccer barefoot in the cul-de-sac. People brought welcome bread and talked about local potlucks. It smelled like new mulch and charcoal grills. It felt like a second chance. But peace, as it turns out, has a natural predator, and her name was Linda Farthington. Officially, she was the president of the HOA. Unofficially, she was the living embodiment of every meme about middle-aged suburban tyranny ever posted on Nextdoor. Her power was small but absolute. She didn't wield influence. She wielded fines. For tall grass. For improperly angled Halloween decorations. For wind chimes that were too melodic. The first time she saw my Jeep, she recoiled like it had hissed at her. "That doesn't belong in this neighborhood," she'd muttered, her lips pulling so tight they nearly vanished into her face. "It looks like it escaped a demolition derby." I explained politely that it was a law enforcement vehicle, used in coordination with the local PD for ongoing surveillance. She blinked, smirked, and replied, "Nice story, soldier boy. Maybe next time, try a Honda like a normal person." That was the moment it began. The passive-aggressive letters. The citations. The bizarre accusations of parking intimidation and tactical aesthetics not aligning with community standards. I had parked the Jeep in my own driveway legally. I had even added a heavy-duty security lock on the front wheel, not just to prevent theft, but to make it visually clear this wasn't some abandoned rust bucket. None of that mattered to Karen, sorry Linda, though calling her Karen feels more honest than cruel. She saw the Jeep not as a vehicle, but as a threat. Not because it was dangerous, but because she couldn't control it. And when people like her can't control something, they destroy it. What she didn't know, because she was too busy memorizing arcane HOA bylaws and weaponizing printable forms, was that the Jeep had been selected because of how much it unsettled people like her. Its militaristic look, the matte black paint, the reinforced bumpers, these weren't accidents. They were camouflage. Psychological misdirection. Suspects looked past it because they expected it to be overkill, an overcompensating veteran's toy. In truth, it was wired tighter than a hacker's laptop. Hidden inside were multiple GPS trackers, night vision cameras, and a low-profile recording unit connected via encrypted network to the task force. And now, all of that was in limbo, ripped from the curb like yard waste. I called the task force immediately, voice trembling, trying to keep the panic from showing through the cracks. They didn't laugh. They didn't even breathe for a beat. 30 minutes later, they were at my door. Not in a squad car, but in silence, black boots on my front steps. Officer Melendez's face went from confused to pale the moment I showed him the cone and the sticky note. And when I told him I had video, his hand flew to his radio, so fast I thought he might snap his own wrist. My neighbor Rick, 2 doors down, had caught everything. His Ring cam rolled 24/7, and that day, it had caught Karen walking up to the Jeep in broad daylight with a pair of bolt cutters like she was the star of her own heist movie. She smiled into the camera. Smiled. Like she'd just solved the great mystery of the universe. "One less eyesore," she had said. Then she walked away as if nothing had happened. By the time the agents left that night, the street was quiet again. But the silence had changed. It wasn't peaceful anymore, it was loaded. Every window was a potential witness. Every porch light felt like an interrogation lamp. And I stood there in the wreckage of my trust, of my faith in systems and civility, knowing that the real story wasn't just about a missing Jeep. It was about a deeper truth. That some people are so obsessed with control, so blinded by the illusion of authority, they'll risk everything just to prove a point. Even if that point destroys them, or worse, destroys the very peace they claim to protect. And in that moment, standing in the cold hum of streetlights and still pulsing adrenaline, I realized something chilling. Karen hadn't just crossed a line. She had no idea the line even existed. I didn't sleep the night after the task force came. I sat on my porch until dawn, staring at the empty spot where the Jeep used to be, still half expecting it to come crawling back like a guilty dog. But nothing came. Just the chirping of early birds and the faint rustle of sprinklers sputtering to life across manicured lawns. Willow Creek Estates looked peaceful again, but it was a fragile piece, like a sheet of glass stretched too thin. I knew it wouldn't last. What Karen had done wasn't just a personal violation, it was a tectonic shift. Something had cracked open, and no amount of HOA protocol was going to seal it back up. The thing about people like her is they don't operate on reason. They operate on control. And now that she'd escalated this war from petty fines to federal interference, I started to realize just how far she might be willing to go to protect her illusion of order. The next morning, I tried to play it normal. I walked my dog. I waved to neighbors. I even nodded politely to Mrs. Jernigan, who always seemed like she was seconds away from accusing someone of having non-regulation patio furniture. But there was a tension in the air now, a low hum beneath the pleasantries. People had heard things. They always do. By noon, I'd gotten 3 text messages from neighbors asking if I was okay. One of them sent a blurry photo of police at my doorstep the night before, taken through a barely cracked set of blinds. I responded with the usual all good, just a misunderstanding, but that lie felt heavier than usual. Because it wasn't a misunderstanding. Not even close. It was an assault in slow motion. And Karen wasn't done. That afternoon, I received a formal HOA violation notice tucked under my doormat. The envelope was thick and officious, practically humming with self-righteousness. Inside was a letter typed in bold 14-point Times New Roman, citing me for obstruction of visual harmony and unauthorized modifications of vehicular appearance in line of public sight. I stared at the phrases, rereading them like some sort of Kafkaesque poem. What the hell was visual harmony? Was that even a real thing? Apparently, in Karen's version of the world, it was. Along with tactical parking posture and intimidation by profile, which I found on page 2 under subsection 4b17. She had created entire terminologies, an invented language of control, just to codify her vendetta. And it wasn't stopping there. Over the next few days, the HOA's passive-aggressive assault evolved into a full-on bureaucratic siege. I got a second notice demanding I submit photographic documentation of all vehicles parked on my property, including license plate numbers and registration records. A third letter followed, citing me for potential noise disturbances due to vehicle design. Meanwhile, the spot where the Jeep used to sit remained conspicuously vacant, like a crime scene that hadn't been cleaned up. I left it that way on purpose. Every time Karen drove by, and she did slowly, like a shark circling a wounded swimmer, I made sure to stand there with my arms crossed, a silent challenge burned into the sidewalk. She never waved. She never made eye contact. But I could see the twitch in her jaw. She was calculating. Plotting. I could feel it. Then came the Facebook posts. At first, they were vague. Karen had always treated the neighborhood Facebook group like her personal kingdom, and now she used it to drip-feed her narrative. A recent incident involving a suspicious vehicle has reminded us all why vigilance matters, she wrote. We must uphold our standards, even when it's uncomfortable. She didn't name me, of course. That would have been too obvious. But everyone knew. The comments poured in. Some residents praised her for taking action. Others asked questions, clearly uncomfortable, but not yet brave enough to challenge her outright. One post in particular caught my attention. Maybe we should have a vote on what kind of vehicles are appropriate for our streets. A vote. As if Karen hadn't already made the decision for everyone. As if democracy existed in a place where fear had become policy. But what she didn't count on, what tyrants never count on, was Rick. Rick, my neighbor, the porch-sitting, ring-cam-having, bush light-drinking historian of suburban anarchy. He had receipts. He had been recording Karen's behavior for months, quietly archiving her letters, her comments, her absurd sidewalk citations. And now he had decided he'd seen enough. One evening, as I was tightening the hinges on my front gate, Karen had filed a noise complaint about the squeak. Naturally, Rick walked over, cooler in one hand, tablet in the other. "Want to see something fun?" he asked, eyes gleaming. What he showed me was a digital folder labeled HOA Tyranny. Inside were dozens of videos, screenshots, even audio recordings of Karen badmouthing residents, mocking veterans, and openly admitting during a Zoom meeting that the board doesn't need to approve every action if the president sees a clear threat to community standards. I stared at the footage, numb. "You've had all this the whole time?" I asked. Rick shrugged. "Didn't think I'd need it. But then she messed with your Jeep, and man, that's a bridge too far." It wasn't just about me anymore. It was about something deeper, something broken in the way power had been allowed to metastasize inside this community. Karen wasn't enforcing rules. She was weaponizing them. The bylaws weren't guidelines, they were ammunition. And the HOA board? Silent, cowed, paralyzed by a mixture of politeness and fear. Until now. With Rick's blessing, I compiled the evidence. I created a timeline. I drafted a report. And I sent it all, every file, every quote, every timestamp, to the task force. The next day I got a visit. Officer Melendez again. No suit this time. Plain clothes, but the tension in his posture was unmistakable. "This is bad," he said, flipping through the documents. "She's not just a nuisance. She's operating outside any legal authority." I nodded, my jaw tight. "She built her own kingdom," I said. "And now she thinks she's immune." Melendez didn't answer. He didn't need to. He just muttered something under his breath and made a call. 15 minutes later, 2 more agents arrived. They set up in my living room, scanning Rick's video like it was evidence from a federal crime scene. And in a way it was. The Jeep's disappearance had disrupted an ongoing surveillance operation. But now it was more than that. Karen's behavior was starting to look like something else entirely. Interference, abuse of power, maybe even obstruction of justice. But before charges could be filed, they needed the Jeep. They needed to find it. And still no one knew where it had been taken. Until Karen made her first real mistake. 3 days after the evidence was submitted, a maintenance worker cleaning up trash behind the HOA's equipment shed noticed a rusted gate slightly ajar. Behind it, overgrown weeds and half-covered tarps. And underneath those tarps, a Jeep. My Jeep. Dirty, scratched, its lock broken, its surveillance housing visibly tampered with. The worker reported it, confused. The city sent a crew. And within hours, Melendez called me with just 3 words. "We found it." That's when everything changed. But this part, this moment, right before the reckoning, was where I realized something terrifying. Karen had been moving in plain sight the entire time. And no one had stopped her. Not because they agreed with her, but because they were afraid to speak. Afraid to challenge her. Afraid to be targeted. That's how systems like this survive, not through majority rule, but through strategic silence. She hadn't just towed a Jeep. She'd hijacked an entire neighborhood's spine. But that spine? It was starting to stiffen again. And soon, Karen Farthington was going to find out what happens when the silence she depended on turns into the sound of voices rising against her. By the time we arrived at the lot, the sun was just beginning to fall, casting long, burnt-orange shadows that stretched across the cracked pavement like ghosts of what used to be order. The rusted gate creaked open with a sound that felt too theatrical to be real, as if the universe itself had been waiting for this moment to take a bow. Officer Melendez stood beside me, jaw tight, hands on his hips as he scanned the overgrown clearing behind the HOA's maintenance shed. Cones, tarps, a couple of half-gutted sedans. And there, tucked behind a collapsed fence panel, sat my Jeep, wounded, dirt-streaked, and unmistakably violated. The lock I had carefully installed was snapped and discarded a few feet away like a broken promise. The driver's side mirror hung limp, cracked. But worse than the physical damage was the gaping hole where the covert surveillance housing had been forcefully pried open. It was gutted, exposed, tampered with in a way that screamed reckless ignorance and unchecked arrogance. Melendez didn't say anything at first. He just took photos. His silence was louder than any curse. When he finally turned to me, his voice was low and precise. "We're calling in a federal evidence team. Don't touch anything." I nodded, numb, as if my body understood protocol better than my mind did. It wasn't long before more agents arrived, and with them, the weight of what this truly was settled on everyone's shoulders. Karen hadn't just confiscated a vehicle, she had interfered with an active federal operation. And not by accident. Not through ignorance. She'd cut through a wheel lock. She'd hired a private tow company with no municipal affiliation. She'd relocated the vehicle to an off-books site behind a shed no resident even knew existed. This wasn't a code violation. This was a rogue operation fueled by delusion and wrapped in the absurd cloak of HOA authority. And just as we were beginning to secure the scene, she arrived. Clacking heels over gravel, red blazer practically glowing in the dying light, clipboard in hand like it could save her. "Oh good," she chirped, as if walking into a bake sale. "You found it." I was about to notify the board. For a second, I thought Melendez was going to laugh. But instead he turned, took 2 steps toward her, and said in a voice sharp enough to shave paint off a wall, "Ma'am, step away from the vehicle." She blinked, stunned, her smile freezing in place like a bad Botox job. "Excuse me? I am the HOA president. I have full authority. You removed federal surveillance property from an active operation," he snapped, cutting her off. "Do you understand how serious that is?" Her eyes narrowed, her posture stiffened, and I could see it then. This was not a woman who thought she'd made a mistake. This was someone who believed, with absolute certainty, that she was the victim in her own story. "It was abandoned," she insisted. "No one moved it. It had a giant lock on it. It was honestly a safety hazard. I did what no one else had the courage to do. I protected the aesthetic integrity of our neighborhood." The words hung in the air like poison. "Aesthetic integrity," I repeated under my breath. Melendez motioned to another agent, who stepped forward and began reading Karen her rights. She didn't resist. But she didn't go quietly either. She kept talking, loudly, confidently, about her duty, her authority, her moral obligation to preserve community standards. Every word was another shovel of dirt on her own grave. By the time she was escorted off the premises, her voice was still echoing through the lot like a bell no one had asked to be rung. Back at my house, Rick was waiting. He had a lawn chair set up at the edge of his driveway, a cooler beside him, and an expression like Christmas had come early. "So," he said, popping open a soda, "you gonna tell her she messed with the feds, or should I put it on Facebook first?" I didn't answer. I just sat down next to him and exhaled for the first time all day. That night, the evidence team worked until well past midnight. They documented every scratch, every missing piece, every fingerprint smudged across the surveillance gear. And the next morning, the task force had what they needed. The footage, the timeline, the motive, the method. It was a case now. A real one. Not just HOA drama. Not just suburban politics. It had teeth. And Karen was squarely in its jaws. But what I hadn't expected, what none of us had, was the sheer speed of the public fallout. Less than 24 hours after the Jeep was recovered, Rick uploaded the ring footage to Reddit under the title, "HOA Karen Cuts Lock, Impounds Jeep, Didn't Know It Was Federal." It hit the front page in 2 hours. By lunch, there were memes. By dinner, there were YouTube reaction videos. Karen's face, once the iron mask of neighborhood order, was now plastered across the internet as the poster child of entitled overreach. And it didn't stop there. News vans rolled into Willow Creek by the second day. They interviewed neighbors, filmed B-roll of the lot, the shed, my front porch. A TikTok creator with 3 million followers reenacted the whole saga with dramatic music and slow-motion editing. Karen was viral, but not in the way she had ever wanted. The HOA board, still reeling from the discovery of the Jeep graveyard, scrambled to save face. Greg, one of the quieter members, called an emergency meeting. I was invited, not just as a resident, but as the person who'd unknowingly triggered the implosion of their carefully controlled world. The meeting was set for Friday evening at the community center, and by the time I arrived, the place was packed. Not just with neighbors, but with legal observers, reporters, and at least 2 individuals in dark suits who stood in the back and said nothing the entire night. Karen was late. 15 minutes. When she finally walked in, she did it like she was hosting a lifestyle seminar. Bright red blazer, clipboard in hand, smile like none of this had touched her. She tapped the mic twice. "Thank you all for coming on such short notice," she began. "I want to address the recent incident involving the removal of an illegally parked, unregistered vehicle from our street. There has been a great deal of confusion and frankly hysteria." That's when I stood up. "Misled?" I said, loud enough to cut through the room. "You cut the lock off a federal surveillance vehicle. You towed it without authorization. You bragged about it on Facebook." The murmurs started immediately. Gasps. Snorts. Shifting chairs. Karen stared daggers, but I walked to the front, pulled a USB drive from my pocket, and handed it to the center's IT guy. He didn't ask questions. He just loaded it up. The projector flickered. First came the ring footage. Karen with the bolt cutters. The smirk. The laugh. Then came her Facebook posts, one by one. Sometimes you have to break the rules to keep the streets clean. The silence in the room was suffocating. Until Greg stood up. "I'd like to make a motion," he said, voice shaking, "to suspend Linda Farthington from her position as HOA president pending a full legal review." A second board member raised her hand. Seconded. A third said, "All in favor?" The vote was unanimous. Karen's mouth fell open. She looked like someone had just unplugged her from reality. She protested, threatened, even waved a cease and desist letter in the air, claiming emotional distress and entrapment. But it was over. She just didn't know it yet. Later that night, as people filed out into the parking lot, talking, laughing, crying, I stood under the floodlight and realized that something fundamental had shifted. Not just in the neighborhood, but in the people. For the first time, fear had been replaced with something else, solidarity. Karen had ruled through silence and shame. But now she was just another cautionary tale. One more example of what happens when control becomes a religion and ego becomes law. The Jeep was back. The operation had collapsed. But something stronger had taken root. And I could feel it humming beneath the ground. A resistance. A reckoning. And Karen hadn't even seen the worst of it yet. The morning after the emergency meeting felt different, not just quieter, but somehow lighter, like the neighborhood itself had exhaled for the first time in years. People were outside early, watering lawns, walking dogs, waving to each other in that awkward way communities do when they've just witnessed the fall of their own tyrant. Karen's house sat silent, blinds drawn, porch empty. No morning patrol. No clipboard. No barking voice reminding people that their flower beds were 2.5 inches off regulation. The void was noticeable. But so was the sense of calm. Still, I didn't trust it. Karen may have been suspended, but she wasn't finished. You could feel it in the air, like the residue of static before a lightning strike. And I was right. She wasn't planning a retreat, she was preparing for war. By noon that same day, a new email went out to all residents of Willow Creek Estates. Subject line: clarifying misunderstandings regarding recent events. The message came from Karen's personal account, not the official HOA board. It began with a painfully condescending tone. "To my beloved community, I am disheartened by the recent display of misinformation and emotional outbursts that have clouded our collective judgment." She framed her actions as a misunderstood act of courage, a necessary intervention in the name of community safety. And then came the bombshell. Karen was calling for a restoration assembly, an HOA town hall meeting of her own design, in defiance of the board's suspension. It was to be held at the same community center, same time slot, but with a new agenda, a defense of her actions and a proposed amendment to the HOA bylaws that would grant emergency executive powers to the president during times of community instability. I read it twice just to make sure I wasn't hallucinating. She wasn't backing down, she was doubling down. I should have felt angry. I should have felt threatened. But honestly, I just felt tired. Tired of the drama. Tired of the manipulation. Tired of living in a neighborhood where mowing your lawn felt like a political act. So I didn't respond. I didn't forward the email. I didn't argue in the Facebook group, which immediately exploded with speculation, rage, and a few oddly supportive comments from the same 3 residents who always seemed to agree with Karen no matter what she did. Instead, I sat on my porch and waited. And just like before, people came to me. Some walked up in person, others sent messages. A few left handwritten notes tucked under my doormat. All of them said the same thing in different ways. She can't be allowed to spin this. We were there. We saw what happened. And that's when I knew we had something Karen never counted on: momentum. The silence she had relied on for years was gone. People were talking. People were remembering. And people were furious. Rick, of course, was already way ahead of everyone. He'd started compiling everything: emails, messages, screenshots of her Facebook posts, PDF exports of her neighborhood-wide rants. He'd even found an old clip from a virtual HOA meeting 3 years ago where Karen bragged that she had unofficial override power because most of the board won't stand up to me anyway. By the next morning, Rick had created a website, HOAwatchdog.net. Simple layout. Black and white. No ads. Just facts. A timeline of events, a breakdown of the surveillance Jeep incident, and a library of downloadable documents and video clips. Within hours, it had traffic. By the next day, it had a comment section full of stories from residents all over the country. People dealing with similar HOA nightmares, similar Karens, similar unchecked power. It was no longer just about us. It was bigger now. Karen's restoration assembly didn't go as planned. She arrived wearing the same red blazer, flanked by her lawyer, an oily man named Trent Maxwell, who looked like he was cast out of a courtroom drama for being too cliché. The crowd, however, was different. It wasn't just curious residents. It was reporters, legal observers, and 3 men in dark suits with federal badges discreetly pinned to their belts. Karen opened with her usual syrupy voice. Thank you all for joining me tonight as we navigate the future of our beloved community. But the crowd wasn't in the mood for navigating anything. When she reached the part about emergency executive powers, someone in the back yelled, "This isn't a monarchy." Others clapped. Some booed. And then the board, all 5 remaining members, stood up in unison. Greg, looking surprisingly composed for a man who once hid behind hydrangeas to avoid Karen, walked to the podium. "Ms. Farthington," he said, voice amplified by the mic, "you are not recognized by this board as having any current authority. This meeting is not sanctioned. Any amendments discussed here will be considered void." Karen scoffed, waving her clipboard. "I have the support of the community." "Do you?" he asked. "Let's find out." And that's when Sasha Lin stepped forward. Detective Sasha Lin, the same task force officer who had been overseeing the investigation, now standing in plain clothes, holding a thick folder. "We've completed our review," she said calmly, speaking into the mic as if she were addressing a jury. "We've confirmed the removal of federal property, the unauthorized impounding of that property, and the destruction of surveillance equipment linked to an ongoing operation. We've also discovered misuse of HOA funds connected to the incident." She paused, opened the folder, and held up a sheet of paper. "These are charges. They've been filed. And while they are currently at the municipal level, a federal investigation remains open." Karen's face collapsed inward like a dying star. Her mouth opened, but no words came out. She looked to her lawyer, who had already started gathering his things. He knew a sinking ship when he saw one. "You haven't heard the last of this," she finally managed to whisper into the microphone, but even that came out hollow, like a threat shouted into an empty canyon. She left through the side door, blazer rumpled, eyes glazed. No one clapped. No one followed. Afterward, people lingered. Conversations blossomed in small groups. Laughter returned. It was the strangest kind of catharsis, quiet, tentative, but real. For the first time, people were talking to each other without fear of being reported for unauthorized neighborly engagement. The board issued a formal apology to the community the next day. They announced sweeping changes, including the dissolution of the so-called Violation Committee, which Karen had ruled like her personal Gestapo. Greg was appointed interim president. He came by my house that evening with a bottle of bourbon and a handwritten note that read, "For services rendered in defense of sanity." We toasted under the porch light. Across the street, someone set off a firework. Rick shouted from his yard, "Freedom tastes like gunpowder and bourbon, baby." I laughed for the first time in weeks. But the best moment came 3 days later, when Melendez returned, not in uniform, but in jeans and a hoodie, holding a manila envelope and a huge grin. "We bought the lot," he said. "The shed. The impound graveyard. City auction. We figured someone should own it who won't use it to store crimes." I blinked. "You're kidding." He handed me the envelope. Inside was the deed. Signed. Stamped. Transferred. "It's yours now," he said. "Do what you want with it." I sat down on the porch step, envelope in hand, staring out at the street that had once felt like a battlefield. And for the first time, I didn't feel like I was under siege. I felt home. Not because the HOA had changed. Not because Karen was gone. But because the people had remembered they were stronger than the system that tried to control them. And in that silence, that stillness, I made a decision. I was going to turn the impound lot into something better. Something honest. Something useful. A community garage. No forms. No fines. No fear. Just tools, space, and a sign above the door that read, "Built from resistance." The sun rose on a Saturday that didn't feel real. The sky was too perfect, like it had been photoshopped, and the air was too still, as if the neighborhood itself was holding its breath. I was sipping coffee on my porch, watching light pool across the street like slow honey, when the convoy arrived. 3 black SUVs, 1 unmarked sedan, and 2 uniformed marshals stepped out with a kind of quiet gravity that made time slow down. They moved with surgical precision, knocking once on Karen's front door before stepping back, announcing their presence with professional finality. No yelling, no drama, just the inevitable force of consequence pulling into the driveway of a woman who had spent years convinced she was untouchable. I didn't need to see the warrant to know what it said. The federal charges had been stacking for weeks: obstruction of justice, tampering with surveillance equipment, misuse of community funds, operating an unlicensed impound lot. And now, finally, they were here to collect. It felt surreal watching Karen being let out of her home in cuffs. She wasn't screaming. She wasn't crying. She looked hollow, like someone who still believed this was all a mistake, that any minute now her lawyer would burst in with some magical loophole and stop the world from turning. But the world didn't stop. She clutched a manila folder to her chest like it contained her last thread of control, but the way her hands trembled told a different story. She shuffled toward the waiting vehicle, flanked by marshals, her red blazer wrinkled like she'd slept in it for days. When the door shut behind her and the SUV pulled away, a strange sound broke across the street, clapping. Not planned. Not organized. Just spontaneous applause from porches, lawns, sidewalks. Neighbors who'd lived in fear of her letters, her citations, her icy stares. Rick even set off a leftover 4th of July firework, just one, and everyone laughed because it felt right. Later that afternoon, Detective Sasha Lynn returned for final interviews and a community debrief. She stopped by my porch again, holding a thick folder labeled Case Closed, Farthington L. Her tone was calm but resolute. "We won't see jail time," she said, "but restitution has been ordered, and she's been barred from serving on any association board in the state for the next 20 years. There will be fines. A lot of them." I nodded, the news washing over me like the last wave at the end of a storm. "What about the HOA?" I asked. She raised an eyebrow. "Most of the board resigned this morning. The rest voted to dissolve. No one wants to touch it." I didn't blame them. Karen's legacy was radioactive. The bylaws she had once quoted like scripture were now nothing more than ashes in a forgotten binder. But something beautiful happened in the vacuum she left behind. Without the HOA's iron grip, the neighborhood didn't fall apart, it bloomed. Front yards exploded in color as people planted whatever flowers they wanted. Mailboxes got painted in every hue of rebellion. Wind chimes returned. Porch swings creaked to life again. Sidewalk chalk murals popped up like acts of civil joy. No one reported anyone. No one knocked on doors holding laminated notices. For the first time, the neighborhood belonged to the people who actually lived in it. And then came the sign. It was Greg's idea, but the whole block pitched in. A custom metal street plaque installed right in front of my house, where the Jeep had once sat like a silent soldier. It read, "Reserved for tactical eyesore." The mailman asked to take a picture with it. Tourists, yes, actual tourists, drove in from nearby towns just to see the infamous driveway. One guy even filmed a YouTube vlog from the sidewalk, narrating the entire Jeep saga like it was a national monument. As for the Jeep itself, the task force returned it to me after replacing the damaged surveillance tech. They added upgrades too, new internal systems, blackout panels, reinforced plating. "A thank you," Melendez had said with a smirk, "for keeping it parked exactly where we told you, even when your HOA went rogue." I laughed, more out of disbelief than anything else. The Jeep had gone from being a code violation to a symbol of resistance. I had it repainted matte black, same shade, but added one detail under the rear bumper, tiny white text that simply read, "Number 01. But the biggest surprise came a week later, when Melendez and Sasha returned again, not in suits or uniforms this time, but in jeans and matching grins. They led me around the back of my house, past the fence, to where the old impound lot had once hidden in weeds and secrecy. It was different now. Cleaned. Cleared. There, hanging from the entrance gate, was a new sign, the garage. Inside, the city had helped install workbenches, tool stations, a repair bay. The whole thing had been transferred to me as part of a community improvement initiative tied to the resolution of the case. "You've got free reign," Sasha said. "Run it how you want. Open hours, no permit required. Just keep it honest." I nodded, still speechless. It was perfect. Not just as a gift, but as a reclaiming of what had been stolen. Not just a Jeep, but trust, space, belonging. Over the next few days, neighbors showed up with tools, paint, old storage bins, spare parts. Teens brought in bikes. One retired vet asked if he could use a corner of the bay to work on his '68 Mustang. I said yes. We didn't need forms. We didn't need rules. We just needed the freedom to build. To celebrate the opening, the task force organized a surprise. One Saturday morning, dozens of Jeeps, military, civilian, vintage, custom, lined the block. Veterans, officers, friends from the community all showed up for a slow, honking parade through the streets of Willow Creek. Kids waved flags. Parents brought folding chairs. Rick live-streamed the whole thing with commentary that ranged from heartfelt to completely ridiculous. At the front of the procession was my Jeep, polished to a mirror shine, the phrase "community watchdog" stenciled across the hood in silver. We ended the parade at the garage, where Sasha gave a short speech and presented me with a plaque, in appreciation for keeping your cool when your HOA went full villain. And that should have been the end. But there was one more twist. A final audit from the HOA's insurance provider uncovered that Karen had been siphoning funds for years. Towing fees, contractor payments, personal office supplies, even catered lunch bills labeled as strategic planning meals. Thousands of dollars redirected under vague line items like aesthetic remediation. With that audit came new charges, this time for financial misconduct and embezzlement. It didn't change her sentence, but it cemented her legacy. Karen Farthington wasn't just a bully. She was a fraud. And as quietly as she had tried to build her little empire, she disappeared even quieter. House sold under market value, moving truck in the dead of night, no goodbyes. Just silence. Months passed. The neighborhood didn't just heal. It flourished. We planted trees, organized community dinners, Someone started a Sunday jam session on the Greenbelt. The scars Karen left behind didn't vanish, but they became part of the story we told each other, about what happens when people forget that rules are supposed to protect, not punish. And every time I stepped into the garage, I saw that lesson forged in metal and sweat. People helping each other, fixing things together, building something real, something human. And the Jeep? It still sits in the driveway. Same spot. Engine humming when I turn it over. It's not just a vehicle anymore. It's a symbol. A relic. A reminder that power without empathy will always collapse under its own weight. And every time I back out of that driveway, passing the sign that says reserved for tactical eyesore, I smile. Not because I won, but because we did. Because we remembered who we were before fear started writing our story. And we took the pen back.